as the United States is not to see these as some Cold War chessboard in which we're in competition with Russia.
President Obama addressing the crisis in Ukraine this week and downplaying the role of the U.S. and Russia. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Syndicated columnist George Will, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, Heritage Action for America's Michael Needham, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Well, President Obama called President Putin on Friday. We're told they spoke for an hour about Ukraine and Syria and Iran, and afterwards White House officials called it surprisingly positive and constructive. And in fact, George, what's more, these officials are now talking about a possible meeting between President Obama and President Putin in Russia this summer to make sign possibly a trade deal using a term of art I learned from the comic strip Peanuts. Is this Lucy in the football all over again?
It could be. The president may not look upon this as the Cold War chessboard, but Putin clearly does. And what's going to be interesting is when the Olympic flame is extinguished later today, and Putin is free from his public relations exercise at the Olympics, what is he going to do? The real danger is the dismemberment of the Ukraine, because Eastern Ukraine is Russian-speaking and associated culturally and historically with Russia. Western Ukraine, much more close to Europe, was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of Poland, so it's got a very mixed history. The United States can influence this probably by weighing in with what Putin has used quite effectively with money, because Ukraine needs the money. Chris, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the French, the British have all lost empires. And with varying speeds and gracefulness, they reconciled themselves to that. Putin is unreconciled to the collapse of his empire.
Congresswoman Harman, I ask you this as a former Democratic, ranking Democrat.
Ready.
You're ready for this?
I'm ready.
Has Russian President Putin outmaneuvered Obama when it comes to Ukraine and Syria and Iran?
Well, he's an obstacle. There's no question. It ain't over till it's over. And I think we would all like to see a more forceful administration policy. After all, we had a forceful policy on Libya. And when that happened, a lot of us said, well, this will set an example for Syria, and it should set an example for Ukraine and elsewhere. And the president said that he would intervene if there was an acute humanitarian crisis, an international coalition, and a way to do this without boots on the ground to protect vital American interests. So I see this playing out across all three theaters. And I don't exactly agree with George, by the way. I agree that Eastern Ukraine aligns with Russia and Western Ukraine is more Western. But I don't think the people of Ukraine want to split up the country. And I think in that sense, the president's right to listen to the people.
I didn't mean to suggest the Ukrainians would want to split the country, but that the Russian army might.
Michael, I'd like you to weigh in on the Putin-Obama dynamic and also give me your sense of what's at stake with Ukraine.
Yeah, well, what's going on in the Ukraine isn't in isolation. You had a situation in Syria where the President of the United States drew a red line. He then allowed Syria to go past that red line and then needed Vladimir Putin to come in and play statesman to get America out of the mess that had been created by that failure to enforce a red line. And so we have a situation in Ukraine which is pretty easy to understand. You have the majority of the Ukrainian people who want to move towards Europe. You have the crooks and spooks in Russia who don't want to let that happen. And the vacuum of American leadership in the world that has been created by our failure to enforce red lines in Syria, by what's going on in Venezuela right now in our own hemisphere, creates an opportunity for a lot of mischief to be going on, which is what you see with the Russians mingling in Ukraine.
We asked you for questions, and we got one on Facebook from Ellen Clagy, and let me read it to you. Since Obama draws red lines and nothing changes, why would Putin respect anything Obama says? Juan, how do you answer Ellen's? Pretty good question.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of somehow waning Western influence or this is about President Obama. To the contrary, what I think is we have President Putin's enemies taking control in Kiev, and Yulia Tymoshenko, you know, she's
Prime Minister.
Yeah, who has long been his rival in terms of that orbit, now looking as if she is going to resume having power. But you go beyond that and you start to think about, you know, even the political consequences. He tried to invest money in the Ukraine, $15 billion. It didn't carry the day with the people. You know, and he has a concern about that naval base in Crimea. He has concern about the gas reserves. All of that now is in question. So to me, Western influence, the deal that was struck with the Germans, the Poles, the U.S., led to the Yanukovych to leave and has put his satellite, this geopolitical game that I believe Putin is playing, in question because clearly his influence is on the wane.
Is it Putin's influence that's on the wane? Is this because of Western strength, or is this because of people power in the streets of Kiev?
Well, people power is prevailing at the moment, but people power against tanks is nothing. So the question is, how ruthless is Putin? He has a track record, and his track record suggests that he is absolutely unreconciled to the diminished status of Russia. And this is his chance, perhaps his last and only chance, to try and recapture great power status.
Let me just pick up on that, because what we've seen so far, and I certainly agree it's a fluid situation, is the police have either, one, returned to their headquarters, or two, are now openly in the street with the protesters. The military has made it clear that they're not going to get involved. Do you really believe that the Russian, I was going to say the Soviet army, the Russian army, a la Budapest, like Prague, might roll down the streets of Kiev and take over?
Not Kiev, but parts of the country. And then you'd have a messy negotiation about whether the territorial integrity of this enormously important country, the size and population of Spain.
Congresswoman.
Yeah, maybe. But 82 people were killed the other day, and the reports are that maybe Putin ordered Yanukovych to do that. Unclear. And what did that do? That caused the people to rise up. I mean, we're seeing this all over the world. My sort of shorthand is that politicians are analog and people are digital. They use social media, and they won't take top-down structures anymore. And sometimes it plays out badly. Think Egypt. But there is a possibility that Putin's efforts could backfire here. And we have to be adroit, we and the rest of the world that really cares about a Ukraine that has a modern, pluralist, technocratic government. That would be what, I think that's what the Ukrainians want. That's what the folks at the Wilson Center who study this think the Ukrainians want. They don't want Putin, and they also don't want a European-dominated government. They want their own government.
One other point to consider is Putin really is sensitive to international investment. He wants international influence. Remember, he's playing the game not only in Syria, but in Iran. In Syria, his client state is again in chaos, much as we've seen in Ukraine. Things are in flux with Iran. So this idea that somehow he is this giant and he's controlling the West, I think is misbegotten.
He's sensitive to the international banking system, which he needs to launder the money.
Very sensitive, I agree.
And that's the pressure point that we have on him.
Exactly.
Well, I don't know. At this point, he seems to be winning in Syria.
No, he's not. How do you figure he's winning in Syria?
Assad is in power. He's not turning over his chemical weapons, and he's continuing to slaughter by the tens of thousands the rebels.
That's not to his advantage. That's not a stable client state that he can rely on.
I understand that, but
okay.
Would you say that the rebels are winning?
No, at this point it's in chaos. But I'm saying that's not good for Putin and for his geopolitical ambitions.
Yeah. Syria owes Russia $10 billion, and Russia wants access to its port, and these things are rather at risk given the state of play there.
All right. We have to take a break here, but we'll see you later in the program. Up next, the nation's governors are meeting in D.C. this week ahead of elections in 36 states this fall, and Democrats not missing an opportunity to criticize their Republican colleagues.
They seem more focused on passing policies that alienate women, minorities, immigrants, gays, and other Americans.
We'll talk with Governor Shumlin and Republican Scott Walker of Wisconsin next.